My rich siblings mocked my Scarecrow costume at Dad's final Halloween party. Then his wool was red. Look, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. The moment I pulled my beat-up F-150 into that circular driveway in the Chicago suburbs, I knew I'd made a mistake coming back. My truck had crossed half the country from Alaska. She'd seen gravel roads that would make your kidneys weep, temperatures that froze diesel in the lines, and more mud than a county fair pig wrestling contest. The old girl wore her battle scars proudly. Rust spots like freckles. A crack in the windshield that looked like lightning. Bumper stickers from truck stops in places most people can't find on a map. And there she sat, my trusty rust bucket, wedged between a midnight blue Bentley and what I'm pretty sure was a Maserati the color champagne. The kind of champagne that cost more than my annual income. My truck looked like a muddy boot at a wedding. David and Claire were waiting on the front steps of the estate. Estate, that's what they called it now. When we were kids, it was just the house. But somewhere along the way, around the time Dad's gaming company went from startup to empire, the house became an estate. Same building, different world. They came down those marble steps in perfect synchronization, like they'd rehearsed it. Maybe they had. David wore a suit that probably cost what I made in 3 months of fishing season. Claire had on one of those outfits that look simple until you realize simple costs a fortune. Her jewelry caught the late October sun and threw it back like tiny accusations. The hugs were cold. I mean, technically they were hugs. Arms went around backs. Cheeks almost touched, but there was no warmth in it. It was like hugging a department store mannequin. You know the gesture happened, but you don't feel anything except awkward. Their smiles were stretched thin. Real thin, like guitar strings tuned way too tight, ready to snap if you played the wrong note. And then came the part that really set the tone. They started talking about me like I wasn't standing right there, 2 steps away, close enough to smell Claire's perfume. Something French and expensive that probably had a name I couldn't pronounce. Claire tilted her head at David, her voice dropping to what she probably thought was a whisper, but was actually just loud enough for me to hear every word. Funny how that works. She said we needed to find me something decent to wear, because I couldn't possibly attend the party looking like that. I glanced down at my flannel shirt. Yeah, it was faded. The red had gone sort of pink from too many washes. There were oil stains on one sleeve from when I fixed the truck's transmission outside Whitehorse. It smelled like road and pine trees, and honest work. This shirt had seen more real life than both of them combined. David nodded along with Claire's assessment of my wardrobe situation, then finally acknowledged my existence with a pat on the shoulder. The kind of pat you give a dog. Not even your dog. Someone else's dog that you're tolerating. He told me not to worry. They'd find something appropriate in Dad's closet. Something that fit the occasion. I wanted to laugh. The occasion. Like this was some society event, and not our father's last Halloween party, before cancer took him away from us completely. But I didn't laugh. I just stood there, listened to them choreograph my appearance like I was a prop for their stage show. See, here's the thing about growing up in the same house as people, and then living completely different lives. You start to speak different languages. They were speaking money and status and appearances. I was speaking survival and simplicity, and things that actually matter. We weren't translating well. Claire mentioned Dad's party with this tone, this exasperated, eye-rolling tone that made it clear she considered the whole thing a tedious obligation. She called it his annual Halloween thing, like it was some quirky habit they had to indulge, like Dad was a child demanding one more bedtime story. The old man wanted everything just like before, she said, inspecting my shirt with the kind of look you'd give roadkill. I felt something cold settle in my chest. They weren't here to say goodbye. They were here to check a box. To show up, be seen, and wait for the inheritance to clear. David must have seen something in my face, because he shifted gears, went into his concerned brother mode, clapped me on the shoulder again and fed me this line about how it was all just formalities, but the important thing was being together as a family. Together. I almost laughed out loud at that one. We hadn't been together in any meaningful way for a decade. Not since I packed up my truck and headed north after realizing I didn't fit in their world anymore. Maybe I never had. David was in corporate mergers or acquisitions or some other thing where people move money around and call it work. Claire married into old East Coast money and spent her time on charity boards and country clubs. And me? I worked fishing boats in Alaska, fixed engines, built things with my hands, and tried to live a life that didn't require pretending to be something I wasn't. We had nothing in common except DNA and a father who was dying upstairs. They led me inside, and man, the place had changed. Or maybe it hadn't, and I had just forgotten how much money can insulate you from reality. Everything gleamed. The floors looked like still water. The chandelier in the foyer threw light around like it was trying to prove a point. There were people everywhere. Caterers setting up. Event coordinators with clipboards. Someone was testing a sound system. The house buzzed with activity. All of it focused on making sure Dad's last party was picture perfect. I wondered if anyone had asked Dad what he actually wanted, or if they'd just assumed and planned accordingly. Probably the latter. They showed me to my old room. Well, what used to be my old room. Now it was a guest suite. My Star Wars posters were gone. The shelf where I kept my rock collection had been replaced with some abstract sculpture that looked like someone had melted a bicycle. The walls were in neutral beige that matched nothing and offended no one. Even my childhood had been renovated out of existence. I dropped my duffel bag on the bed and just stood there for a minute, feeling like a ghost of my own past. The room smelled like vanilla candles and fresh laundry. Nothing like the mixture of model glue and teenage ambition it used to smell like. There was a knock on the door frame. Not the door, the frame. Tentative, soft. It was a hospice nurse, Margaret. She had tired eyes but a surprisingly firm handshake. She'd been with Dad for 3 months now, and she was one of those people who radiate competence and compassion in equal measure. The kind of person who can tell you terrible news and somehow make you feel less alone in hearing it. She said Dad was asking for me, wanted to see me before he got too tired. I followed her down the hall to the master bedroom. The door was open. Inside, the curtains were drawn against the afternoon sun, and the room existed in this soft twilight that made everything feel suspended, like time moved different in there. Dad was in the hospital bed they brought in. He looked small. That's the thing nobody tells you about watching someone die. They seem to shrink. This man who built a gaming empire, who taught me to fish and play chess and think 3 moves ahead, was disappearing inside his own skin. But his eyes were still sharp. Margaret excused herself quietly, and I pulled up the chair next to the bed. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. Sometimes silence is its own conversation. Then Dad asked me about the drive. Was the Alkin Highway still a beast? Did I stop at that diner in Fort Nelson with a good pie? I told him about the road, about fixing a flat tire in the Yukon with nothing but a hand jack and stubbornness, about seeing the northern lights dance green across the sky somewhere past Dawson Creek, about a grizzly bear that crossed the highway and stopped in the middle of the road to look back at me, like it was checking to see if I was worth bothering with. He smiled, a real smile, the kind that reaches the eyes and means something. We talked about fishing, about the lake cabin we used to go to when I was a kid, about the summer I caught that pike that was bigger than me. And we took a picture that Mom framed and hung in the kitchen until she passed. Simple things, real things. Then his hand found mine. His grip was weak but deliberate. He looked at me with an intensity that cut through the medication haze, and he said something I didn't fully understand at the time. He told me they only see the pieces on the board, but they don't see the game itself. He made me promise to remember that. I nodded, not sure what he meant, but understanding it was important. Then he asked me to do something. Said there was an old costume up in the attic. A Scarecrow costume we'd made together for my 5th grade play. He wanted me to bring it down. Wanted it at the party. I must have looked confused because he squeezed my hand tighter and explained. Sort of. He said the costume reminded him that important things often look unimpressive from the outside, that what matters isn't always shiny or obvious, that sometimes the most valuable pieces look like they should be ignored. His eyes held mine, and in that moment, I saw past the sick old man to the genius who'd built worlds inside computers, the strategist who'd taught me that every game has rules, But great players know which rules are actually suggestions. Maybe he did see everything. Maybe he'd been seeing it all along. I promised him I'd get the costume. He relaxed back into the pillows, satisfied. As I stood to leave, he said one more thing. Told me not to let them make me feel small. Said I was worth more than I thought, and definitely worth more than they assumed. I nodded, my throat too tight to answer. The rest of the day was like watching a slow-motion train wreck you're starring in. I went up to the attic. The air up there was thick with the ghosts of forgotten things. I found the costume in a cardboard box with Sam's play stuff scrawled on the side in my own kid handwriting. I lifted the lid. The whole thing smelled like dust and time. I reached in and touched the burlap shirt. It was rough, scratchy. For a split second, I was in the attic. I was 10 years old, sitting on the garage floor next to Dad, watching his big, capable hands carefully stitching a patch onto the very same fabric. The memory was so clear it hurt. I brought it down and left it on a chair in the main hall, like Dad asked. Claire walked past it 3 times before she actually noticed it. When she did, her nose wrinkled like she stepped in something unpleasant. She picked it up with 2 fingers, holding it away from her designer outfit, and asked what this ratty thing was doing in the house. I told her Dad wanted it at the party. She laughed. Not a nice laugh. The kind of laugh that has edges. She said of course he did. He probably wanted to remind everyone of simpler times. And wasn't that just precious? She dropped the costume back on the chair like it might have fleas. I wandered through the house, increasingly feeling like I was visiting a museum dedicated to a life I used to live. Everything was familiar, but wrong. Like looking at your face in a funhouse mirror. And then I started noticing the little things. The small cruelties that people who consider themselves sophisticated specialize in. Claire was on the phone with someone. A friend, maybe. Her voice carried through the house with that particular acoustics of not caring who hears you. She was talking about the party, about Dad, about the whole situation. And then she said it. Called me their country cousin. Said I'd shown up looking like I'd been mud wrestling bears, which wasn't far from truth, but the way she said it wasn't affectionate. It was dismissive. Like I was a joke. Like I was an embarrassment. Later, I walked past a study where David was having a conference call with someone. A lawyer, from the sound of it. They were discussing estate details, division of assets, probate timelines. All very professional and cold. And then David said something that made my blood stop moving. He told the lawyer they'd handle the complex aspect of the estate, the business holdings, the investment portfolios, the property trusts. And then he added, almost as an afterthought, that they'd manage the simpler aspects too, by which he meant me. I was a simple aspect, a line item, something to be managed and filed away under miscellaneous. Not a brother, not family, not a person with thoughts and feelings, and a legitimate stake in what was happening. Just a problem to be solved efficiently. I stood in that hallway outside the study, and something crystallized inside me. It wasn't anger exactly. Anger is hot and immediate. This was colder, clearer. This was understanding. They'd already divided everything up. They'd already decided how the game would end. They'd written me out a story before I'd even arrived. I was supposed to be set dressing, background noise, the rustic brother who'd show up, be appropriately sad, and then fade back into the wilderness while they carved up Dad's empire like a Thanksgiving turkey. I was supposed to know my place. I went back to my old room that wasn't mine anymore and sat on the bed. The house thrummed with preparation for the party. People rushed around making sure every detail was perfect for Dad's big farewell performance. And I thought about that Scarecrow costume, about why Dad wanted it there, about what he'd said. Important things often look unimpressive. They only see the pieces, not the game. I picked up my phone and almost called my buddy Jake back in Anchorage. Almost told him I was going to cut this visit short and head home, that this was a mistake, that I didn't belong here and never would. But I didn't make the call, because somewhere in the back of my mind, Dad's words were echoing, his hand squeezing mine, that look in his eyes that said, trust me, trust the game, wait and see. So I decided to wait, to watch, to be the simple piece they thought I was. Sometimes the best move is to let your opponent think they've already won. I grabbed a beer from the fridge, one of those craft IPAs that David probably bought to impress his friends, and took it out to the back patio. The sun was setting over the manicured lawn. Halloween decorations dotted the yard. Tasteful ones. Nothing too scary or fun. Just expensive seasonal ambience. Inside, I could hear Claire directing the caterers. David was on another call. The house was filling up with the kind of organized chaos that money buys. And I stood there, drinking my beer, feeling more alone than I'd felt in any blizzard or on any empty highway. Because being alone in the wilderness is one thing. Being alone in a house full of people who share your blood but not your heart, that's a different kind of isolation. That's the kind that cuts deep. I looked at my reflection in the patio door glass. Faded flannel, worn jeans, boots that had walked more honest miles than most people drive in a lifetime. I looked exactly like what I was, what I'd chosen to be. And for the first time since arriving, I wondered if that had been Dad's plan all along. If maybe looking like you don't belong is exactly how you win, when everyone else is playing pretend. The Scarecrow costume was inside, waiting. The party would start soon. And somewhere in this perfect, polished house, a game was being played that nobody but Dad and maybe me could see. I finished my beer. The sun disappeared below the horizon, and I waited for the show to begin. The party started at 8. By 8:15, the house had transformed into something that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread about how the other half lives, which I guess was exactly the point. The guests arrived in waves. Black cars with drivers. Designer everything. Masks that probably cost more than my monthly rent back in Anchorage. Venetian style, mostly. Ornate. Expensive. The kind of masks that say I'm hiding my face, but make sure you know how much I pay to do it. The whole place hummed like a beehive. That constant buzz of people who think their conversations matter. Business deals disguised as small talk. Social climbing dressed up as friendship. Everyone performing for everyone else. Dad used to say something about parties like this. He told me once, after some company gala he'd been forced to attend, that the loudest parties are thrown by the loneliest people. At the time, I thought he was just being cynical. Now, standing in the middle of the circus, I understood exactly what he meant. These people weren't celebrating. They were filling silence. I grabbed a beer from one of the bars they'd set up. Not the champagne everyone else was drinking. Just a regular beer. The bartender looked at me like I'd asked for motor oil. He wiped down a perfectly clean counter before turning away, then finally found a bottle somewhere in the back. I posted up near a window overlooking the backyard. The Halloween decorations looked different at night. String lights and projection effects turned the whole yard into this manufactured spooky atmosphere. Very Instagram-worthy. Very fake. From my spot, I could watch the whole room. It was like viewing a nature documentary about a species I didn't belong to. David and Claire worked the crowd like politicians. Handshakes. Air kisses. That laugh that rich people do that doesn't sound like real laughter. More like a social signal. I'm engaged. I'm charming. I'm one of you. People kept approaching them with these concerned faces, asking about poor Richard. How was he doing? Such a shame. So young. What a brilliant mind. They'd touch David's arm or Claire's shoulder, making these sympathetic noises that sounded rehearsed. And then, within 30 seconds, the conversation would shift. How's the market treating you? Did you hear about the Henderson merger? Have you been to that new place in Tribeca? Poor Richard was just an appetizer, a way to establish that you cared before moving on to what you actually wanted to talk about. I stood there with my beer, feeling more isolated than I'd ever felt during a wideout on the Dalton Highway. At least in a blizzard, you know you're alone. Here, I was surrounded by 100 people and might as well have been invisible. A woman in a peacock mask glanced at me, then quickly looked away. I didn't fit the aesthetic. Wrong clothes, wrong drink, wrong everything. I caught my reflection in the window glass. Flannel shirt, jeans, boots. I looked exactly like what I was. A working man at a rich person's costume party. And I wasn't even wearing a costume. Actually, That wasn't quite true. Everyone else was wearing masks. I was the only one showing my actual face. Funny how that works. Around 9:30, David caught my eye from across the room. He did this little head gesture, the kind that means follow me. Now, I debated pretending I didn't see it, but curiosity won. Plus, standing alone by a window was getting old. I followed him through the crowd, past the catering staff circulated with trays of things on crackers, past clusters of people laughing at jokes that probably weren't that funny, into the study. Dad's study, though it didn't look much like his anymore. They'd already started redecorating. The gaming memorabilia was gone. The chess sets, the frame concept art from his games, all replaced with generic corporate art and leather furniture that looked expensive and felt empty. David closed the door behind us. The noise from the party became muffled, distant, like we'd entered a soundproof booth. The room smelled like cigar smoke and entitlement. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. David never did when there wasn't an audience to perform for. He walked over to the desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a checkbook. Not the kind you get from a regular bank. The fancy kind. The kind that comes from wealth management firms with names like Worthington and Associates. He wrote something, tore out the check, and slid it across the desk toward me. I looked down at it. $250,000. The number just sat there on that piece of paper. More money than I'd see in 5 years of hard work. Maybe 10. Written in David's precise handwriting like it was nothing, like he was tipping a waiter. He leaned back against the desk, arms crossed, trying to look casual. But I saw it, the slight, repetitive tap of his thumb against his bicep, a nervous little rhythm that betrayed the calm facade. He was confident, sure, but also impatient, annoyed that he even had to do this. He told me to take it. His voice had that tone people use when they're trying to sound reasonable while being completely unreasonable. Like a banker explaining to a child why they can't have a lollipop. Buy yourself a new truck, he said. Maybe even a little piece of land up in Alaska. Consider it seed money for your simple life. He and Claire would handle the complicated stuff here. The estate, the business, the things that required, sophistication. I just stood there, staring at that check. He wasn't offering me money. He was pricing out my silence, my absence, my willingness to disappear back into the wilderness and let them carve up Dad's legacy like a Thanksgiving turkey. $250,000. That was apparently what my share of our father's life was worth. That was the value David had assigned to me staying out of the way. I looked up at him, really looked at him, tried to find my brother somewhere in that face. The kid I used to build forts with, the teenager who taught me to drive, the person I thought I knew. He wasn't there. Maybe he never had been. I shook my head. Didn't say anything. Just shook my head. David's expression changed. The fake reasonableness evaporated. His face twisted into something uglier, more honest. He told me fine. Suit yourself. But don't come crying later when I realized what I'd passed up. He actually used that word. Crying. Then he called me something I won't repeat, but it basically translated to backwards hillbilly. He said I could go back to my fish and my truck and my little cabin in the middle of nowhere, and when I was old and broke and had nothing to show for my life, I should remember this moment. Remember that he tried to help me. I didn't respond, didn't defend myself, didn't argue. I just looked at him until he got uncomfortable and looked away first. Then I walked out. Back in the party, the noise hit me like a wave. Laughter, music, the clink of glasses. All of it felt obscene suddenly, grotesque, like dancing on a grave that hadn't been filled in yet. I needed air, or another beer, or both. I was heading toward the patio doors when Claire materialized in front of me. She wasn't alone. She had the Scarecrow costume draped over her arm, holding it between two fingers like it might be contaminated. David was with her. They'd coordinated this. Of course they had. Claire's voice carried that particular tone of amused condescension. "Oh, God," she said, "that actually made you dig this thing out?" She held it up for David to see, for the nearby guest to notice. Did David remember? She asked, When I wore this in school play, when I stood on stage and straw started falling out, when the whole auditorium lost it. David laughed, started adding details I didn't remember or that hadn't happened. Made it sound even more humiliating, even more pathetic. They were performing now, for each other, for the guests who were starting to pay attention, making sure everyone knew the story, making sure everyone understood that I was a joke. Other people were looking now, smiling behind their masks. Some woman in diamonds said something about how sweet it was that their father was sentimental. Sweet, like it was charming and quaint and just adorable that the old man wanted his hillbilly son to bring a moldy costume to his last party. Claire draped it over a chair near where we stood, like evidence, like proof of something. And I stood there listening to them laugh, watching them weaponize the one genuine thing Dad and I had shared, turning a memory of father and son sitting in a garage, working on a costume together, into cocktail party entertainment. They took that memory and threw it on the floor like trash. Something happened in that moment, something cold and final. The hurt didn't go away. It transformed, crystallized, became something harder, something patient, like permafrost, like the ground in the Yukon that stays frozen so deep that nothing can thaw it. Not time, not sun, not hope. I stopped wanting to defend myself, stopped wanting them to see me or understand me or treat me like family. I just wanted to wait, because Dad's words were echoing in my head. They only see the pieces. They don't see the game. I picked up the costume from the chair where Claire had tossed it, folded it carefully, ignored their looks, and I walked away without saying a word. I found a quiet corner near the back of the house, away from the party, away from the performance, just me and the costume and the weight of everything that had happened in the last few hours. I sat down in one of those uncomfortable decorative chairs that aren't meant for actual sitting and just breathed. The party continued without me. It would have continued without all of us. These people didn't care about Dad. They didn't care about family or legacy or anything real. They cared about being seen, about connections, about maintaining their place in whatever hierarchy they'd built in their heads. Dad understood that. He'd lived in this world, built a success in it, and somewhere along the way, he'd figured out how hollow it all was. I looked down at the costume in my lap, ran my fingers over the rough burlap, found the patch I'd watched Dad sew on all those years ago. Important things often look unimpressive. I was still sitting there, lost in thought, when I felt a hand on my elbow. Margaret, the nurse. Her tired eyes looked even more tired now. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there with this expression that told me everything I needed to know before she opened her mouth. "He's gone," she said quietly, just now, very peacefully. The words hit me like I'd been expecting them, and like I'd never been more surprised in my life. Both at once. Dad was dead. I nodded, asked if he said anything. Margaret shook her head, said he'd just closed his eyes during a commercial break of some show he'd been half watching. Just drifted off. No pain, no struggle, just their one moment and gone the next. The way he'd have wanted it, probably. Quick, efficient, on his own terms as much as death allows. I asked if anyone else knew yet. She said no. She'd come to find me first. Thought I should know before making any announcements. I thanked her. She squeezed my arm once and then quietly headed back upstairs to do whatever needed to be done. Paperwork, procedures, the administrative side of death. I stood up slowly, the costume still in my hands, and I looked back into the party. The room was alive with motion, people dancing, drinking, networking, celebrating. Whatever this was, I could see Claire near the fireplace, laughing at something a man in an expensive suit was saying. Her hand touched his arm. Everything about her body language said she was having the time of her life. David was by the bar, pouring champagne for a group of people I didn't recognize, playing the generous host, the successful son, the man who had everything under control. They had no idea that upstairs in the master bedroom, their father had just taken his last breath. No idea that the game they thought they'd already won had just entered its final phase. No idea that I was standing here, holding a Scarecrow costume, watching them celebrate while the king's body was still warm. I felt something settle over me. Something calm. Something certain. Not revenge. Not yet. That was too hot. Too impulsive. This was colder. More patient. This was a feeling you get when you finally understand the rules of a game you didn't know you were playing. When all the pieces suddenly make sense. When you see the board the way it actually is, not the way you thought it was. I folded the costume over my arm. The party would continue. David and Claire would laugh and drink and network. They'd perform their grief when the time came. They'd play their parts perfectly. And I would watch. Because somewhere in this house, in a sealed envelope or a locked drawer or on a DVD disc with careful handwriting, Dad had left his final move. And I was the only one who knew the game had already begun. I looked at my watch. 10:45. The night was just getting started. And so was everything else. At exactly 11 o'clock, the music stopped. Not faded out. Not gradually lowered. Just stopped. Like someone had pulled a plug. The sudden silence hit the room like a physical thing. Conversations died mid-sentence. Champagne glasses paused halfway to lips. Even the caterers froze, trays balanced in their hands. Everyone turned toward the entrance. Standing in the doorway was a man who looked like he'd stepped out of a Dickens novel. Tall, gaunt, somewhere between 70 and immortal. He wore a black suit that had probably been expensive 40 years ago and had aged into something more intimidating than any modern designer could create. Mr. Hayes, Dad's lawyer. I'd met him exactly once, at Mom's funeral. He'd been old then. Now he looked like Death's accountant. The kind of guy who'd read you your own eulogy and charge you for privilege. David spotted him immediately. I watched my brother's face shift through about 3 different expressions in 2 seconds. Surprise, calculation, performance mode. He stepped forward, and suddenly he wasn't the smug host with the champagne bottle anymore. He was a grieving son. Shoulders slumped just right. Expression perfectly calibrated between sorrow and dignity. Oscar-worthy, really. David's voice carried across the silent room as he announced that he had difficult news to share. Our father had passed away peacefully earlier this evening. He paused for effect, let the gasps and murmurs wash over him, accepted the immediate wave of condolences with just the right amount of gracious sadness. But I saw his eyes, just for a second, when he glanced toward Claire. Pure triumph. The king is dead. Long live the kings. Hayes didn't waste time with pleasantries. He said he understood this was a difficult moment, but Richard had left specific instructions. The formal reading of the will would occur next week at his office, with all proper procedures followed. However, Richard had also prepared a letter of intent to be read immediately following his passing. Tonight, now, Claire materialized beside David, her mask of grief matching his perfectly. She said something about how Father always did love his sense of order and timing, like this was charming, like he'd planned an elaborate surprise party instead of his own death announcement. The remaining guests started making quiet exits. This wasn't their circus anymore. Within 5 minutes, the room had cleared except for David, Claire, me, Hayes, and a handful of people too curious or too close to the family to leave. Hayes opened his briefcase. The sound of the latches clicking open was absurdly loud in the quiet room. He pulled out a document, not some informal note, an official-looking thing with letterhead and signatures and the weight of law behind it. He adjusted his reading glasses with the careful precision of a surgeon preparing for an operation, and then he started reading. The estate, including the house and all property, would go to David. The investment portfolio and stock holdings outside the company would go to Claire. The liquid assets from the sale of Mind Palace games would be divided equally among the 3 children. Simple, clean, logical. I watched David's face as Hayes read, watched him try to contain his satisfaction. He was getting the estate, the house, the physical symbol of everything Dad had built, the place where you could host parties and impress people and show everyone exactly how successful you were. Claire was getting the money she could spend freely, the investment she could manage, the liquid wealth that could fund her lifestyle without restriction. And me, I was getting a third of the company's sale money. A nice chunk. Enough to live comfortably. Enough to be comfortable and quiet and out of the way. They'd gotten everything they wanted. Control, status, money, freedom. Hayes finished reading, folded the document, returned it to his briefcase with the same careful precision. The room was silent for a moment, respectful, appropriate. And then David turned to Claire. He picked up his champagne glass from where he'd set it down during the announcement. She picked up hers. And right there, in front of everyone, they touched glasses together. Not even subtle about it. Not even pretending this was about grief or family or saying goodbye to their father. Just a simple clink of crystal. A deal sealed. A victory celebrated. David looked at me over the rim of his glass as he took a sip, and in his eyes, I saw exactly what he was thinking. Checkmate. Game over. They'd won. I'd lost. Time to go back to Alaska and my simple life and let the adults handle the complicated stuff. Everyone started moving again, breathing, talking in low voices. The social machinery grinding back into motion. Hayes was packing up his briefcase. David was already making calls, probably to his financial advisor. Claire was texting someone, a small smile playing at her lips. Nobody was looking at me. I was furniture. Background. The simple brother who'd gotten his simple share and would now simply disappear. Exactly what they'd planned. I stayed where I was, standing near the back of the room. My eyes drifted across the space, not really focusing on anything particular, just observing, processing, thinking. And then I saw it. The Scarecrow costume, still draped over the chair where I'd left it, ignored, forgotten, exactly like me. Something clicked in my brain. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet recognition, like solving a puzzle you didn't know you were working on. Dad's words came back, not the ones about pieces and games. Different words. Words he'd said so quietly I'd almost missed them. Words that seemed like rambling, but now felt like instructions. The most important piece on the board isn't the one wearing the crown. It's the one that looks the simplest. The one everyone ignores. I looked at that costume. Really looked at it. Dad had asked for it specifically. Had wanted it at the party. Had told me it reminded him that important things often look unimpressive. This wasn't checkmate. This was a pawn sacrifice. The oldest trick in chess. You sacrifice a piece everyone thinks matters to distract from the piece that actually wins the game. You let your opponent think they're winning. Let them celebrate. Let them drop their guard. And then you move the piece they forgot to watch. I walked over to the chair, picked up the costume, held it in my hands like it was something precious. Because maybe it was. David glanced over at me, probably wondering what the weird brother was doing now. But his phone rang, and he turned away, already dismissing me from his attention. Perfect. I carried the costume out of the room, down the hall, toward the back of the house where there was better light. My hands were moving before my brain fully caught up, feeling along the rough burlap, looking for something, anything. And then I found it, the patch. The one Dad had sewn on when I was 10. The one Claire had mocked earlier tonight. My fingers pressed against it. It was hard, not burlap hard. Something underneath hard. I pulled out my pocket knife. The same one I use to gut fish and cut rope and handle 1,000 practical tasks. I carefully worked the blade under the stitching Dad had sewn 25 years ago. The threads gave way. The patch opened like a secret pocket. And inside, wrapped in wax paper, was a key. Not a modern key. Not something digital or electronic. An old-fashioned key. The kind you'd use for a safe deposit box or a lockbox. Brass, tarnished with age, with an unusual shape, almost like a chess piece. A night, maybe, I turned it over my palm, and something about it felt familiar. Dad had a collection of antique keys, used to display them in his study, called them physical passwords to forgotten rooms. One of the desks in his study had a small lockbox built into it. Fancy Italian thing. Dad had showed it to me once, said the key had been lost decades ago. Just a decorative mystery now. Except maybe the key hadn't been lost. Maybe it had been hidden. I closed my fist around the key and headed back toward the study. The room was empty now. David and Claire were elsewhere, probably making more calls, planning their next moves. The guests were gone. Even Hayes had left. I closed the door behind me. The desk sat there like a monument. Solid oak. The kind of furniture that outlives the people who own it. I'd watched Dad work at this desk 1,000 times. Watched him design games and write code and build empires from this exact spot. I ran my hands along the bottom drawer. Found a small lockbox built into the side, just like I remembered. The key slid in like it had been waiting 25 years for this exact moment. It turned with a soft click that sounded like inevitability. Inside was a single DVD disc. The case was clear plastic, and on the disc itself, written in Dad's distinctive handwriting, were 3 words. Play me last. My hand was shaking, just slightly, just enough to notice. I looked at the entertainment system Dad had installed in the study, top of the line, connected to every screen in the house through some smart home system he'd built himself. He'd been proud of it. Showed me how it worked, how you could control everything from one place. I picked up the disc, walked to the player. The house was quiet. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear David's voice, Claire's laugh. They had no idea. I put the disc in the player. My finger hovered over the play button for just a second. This was it. Whatever Dad had planned, whatever game he'd been playing, it all came down to this moment. I pressed play. For a second, nothing happened, just the whir of the disc spinning. And then, one by one, every screen in the house went dark. The digital photo frames, the TV in the main room, the displays in the kitchen, everything connected to Dad's system just shut down, and then they all turned on at once. Dad's face appeared, not old and sick like I'd seen him earlier. This was recorded months ago, maybe longer. He looked thin but alert, sharp. His eyes had that gleam they got when he was 10 moves ahead of everyone else. His voice came through every speaker in the house. He said welcome to his last party, hoped everyone had enjoyed themselves, appreciated everyone coming to say goodbye. I heard footsteps, running. David and Claire, drawn by the sound of Dad's voice coming from everywhere at once. Dad kept talking. His tone was conversational, almost friendly, like he was catching up with old friends. He said he wanted to clear up a few things before the evening ended, some truths that needed to be spoken, some accounts that needed settling. David and Claire burst into the study. Their faces went white when they saw Dad on the screen, saw me standing by the player, but they couldn't stop it. The video was already playing, already broadcasting to every screen. Dad looked directly at the camera, at them, at everyone. He said David had a gambling problem, specifically a $2.3 million debt to some very specific people in Vegas. Said he knew David had been planning to use company funds to pay it off quietly, had been planning it for months. David's face went from white to red. His mouth opened, closed. No words came out. Dad moved on. He said Claire's charitable foundation was creative accounting, a tax shelter and a cover for personal expenses. Those trips to Milan weren't for charity work. They were shopping sprees and luxury vacations, all funded by donations from people who thought they were helping children. Claire made a sound like she'd been punched. Dad smiled on the screen. Not mean, not cruel, just matter of fact, like he was explaining the rules of a game. He said the document Hayes had just read was real, legally binding, but also completely superseded by the actual will, which Hayes would file officially in the morning. This was just a bait, the piece you sacrifice to see how your opponents react. And they'd reacted exactly as he predicted, with that champagne toast, with that look, with that absolute certainty that they'd won. Dad said his actual was very different, very simple. 100% of Mind Palace games, all patents, all intellectual property, all assets associated with the company. $58 million worth. All of it went to Sam. The room spun. I grabbed the desk to steady myself. Dad kept talking. Said I was the only one who remembered that games are supposed to be fun. that the point isn't winning at any cost, that sometimes the best move is to not play the games other people think matter. He said the house and everything in it would be sold at auction, all proceeds going to the children's hospital where Mom had been treated. Said David and Claire had always hated this place anyway. Now they were free of it. He said they would receive nothing else. Zero. Zip. Nada. Nothing. The video ended. The screens went dark, and then they flickered back to their normal displays. Family photos. Peaceful landscapes. Like nothing had happened, but everything had happened. I turned to look at David and Claire. They stood there like statues, like their brains had blue-screened and they were stuck buffering. Their faces were pale, their mouths open. Their perfect masks had shattered completely. Behind them, I could see a few remaining guests in the doorway, people who'd heard the commotion, who'd seen the video, who'd witnessed everything. David and Claire's dirty laundry, their schemes, their contempt for their father, their celebration of his death. All of it public, all of it witnessed, all of it now part of the permanent record of who they really were. Dad hadn't just taken their inheritance. He'd taken their reputations, their social standing, their carefully constructed facades. He'd stripped them bare in front of everyone who mattered to them. It was brutal. It was perfect. It was exactly the kind of move Dad would make. I walked over to the chair, picked up the Scarecrow costume one more time, found the hat, the straw hat that Claire had mocked, that I'd worn on stage when I was 10, and everyone had laughed. I put it on my head. It fit perfectly. I walked toward David and Claire. They didn't move, couldn't move, just stood there, frozen in their shock and horror and complete, total defeat. I stopped right in front of them, close enough that only they could hear what I said next. I told them it looked like they needed to find something more appropriate to wear, something that fit their new circumstances. I suggested they start looking now, and then I walked past them, through the study door, into the hallway, wearing a straw hat and carrying a burlap costume and owning every single thing Dad had built. Behind me, I heard Claire make a sound, something between a sob and a scream. Heard David start shouting something, probably threats. Probably promises to sue. Probably all the things people say when they've lost everything and can't accept it. But I didn't stop, didn't turn around. I walked out of that house. My house now, at least until the auction, past the remaining guests who watched me with wide eyes, past the catering staff who'd stopped pretending to work, past all of it. I walked out to the driveway where my beat-up F-150 still sat between the luxury cars. Except now, my truck didn't look out of place. It looked exactly right. Honest. Real. Earned. The expensive cars looked like what they were. Props. Decorations. Empty symbols of empty lives. I climbed into the driver's seat, tossed the Scarecrow costume onto the passenger seat, adjusted the straw hat on my head, started the engine. She turned over with that familiar rumble. The sound of something that works because you maintain it, not because you bought the most expensive version. I looked back at the house one last time. The estate, the monument to success, the perfect, polished symbol of everything David and Claire had wanted. Soon it would belong to sick kids. Kids who needed hope more than anyone needed a mansion. Dad had played the longest game. Waited until the very end. Let them think they'd won. Let them celebrate. Let them show everyone exactly who they were. And then he moved the piece they'd ignored. The Scarecrow, the simple brother, the one who looked unimpressive and easy to dismiss, the pawn that turned into a queen. I put the truck in gear and headed down the driveway, away from that world, back toward mine. Except now, my world had a $58 million problem I needed to figure out, but that was tomorrow's worry. Tonight, I was just a guy in a flannel shirt and a straw hat, driving a rusty truck, who just inherited a gaming empire because his dad had taught him that the most important move isn't the flashiest one. It's the one nobody sees coming. In my rearview mirror, the house got smaller. The party was over. The game was finished. The king was dead. And the Scarecrow had taken everything. I smiled. First real smile I'd had since arriving. Dad would have loved this. Actually, he did love it. That's why he built it. Checkmate, indeed.